Now, in the DVD documentary, three very different productions. The kind of sort of music in the community writ large, celebrated on the first one, El Sistema, which is focusing on the amazing work which really lies behind the Simon Bolivar Youth Orchestra and Gustavo Dudamel.
Yeah, this story has been told many times over the last few years, and I think where it's most important is in the fact that it has sparked a worldwide fever of musical philanthropy, of musical, as you say, community work. We've seen copycat sistemas start up all around the world, not least here in the UK. Julian Lloyd-Webber has started the In Harmony project. Dudamel now, who's running the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra, is doing something similar in LA.
But somehow it's difficult to imagine it going from, kids coming from such an amazingly deprived background to creating amazing music. I mean, it's just, the polls that this documentary shows up are quite astounding.
I think that's absolutely true. I think it's probably, it is a fascinating documentary as well. It's very well done. It catches everything that's wonderful about the project. But I do wonder whether this sort of project is more ostentatiously successful in a society where the society itself is more polarised, where you have really terrible poverty and some really dreadful places to live, and of course you have enough of a wealthy middle class to fund them to get out of it through projects like this. One does wonder, you're right, whether in the UK it will be as successful, because in the UK we're generally more comfortable and maybe people aren't quite so desperate to work at something to give their life a focus that had previously been missing. Obviously that's a huge generalisation, but in this very stark territory of Venezuela, with all the country's own inherent problems, this comes across as a really
It's a real kind of feel-good documentary, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Now, the next one focuses on one of the huge musical presences of the last century, Leonard Bernstein. Now, this is something of a sort of semi-antique, because it was actually made quite a long time ago and has only just now seen the light of day.
Yes, that's true. It was made by the American Diplomatic Corps, who at one point embarked on a series of films with their leading artists, and these were only ever shown maybe once on American TV. I think this one actually might have been shown once on the BBC way back in the mists of time. But really they were only regularly shown in embassies, in US embassies around the world, and they were designed to show people that Americans could do culture. And this was one reason why Bernstein opens up so much in this documentary, more than in any other documentary I've seen, although it's quite short. You just see him in various situations, but one of them is just lying on his sofa in his apartment, and he talks about his father, and he talks about things that are important to him, and you really feel for once that you're seeing beyond Bernstein the showman. And having spoken to the director of the documentary, it's apparently for two reasons. Firstly, because he was so moved to be doing something for his country, for America, which is interesting given all the dossiers that were kept on him by the CIA, that he was very happy to do this. And also because sadly his wife was dying, and apparently she was actually dying in the next room while they were filming, but he insisted on going on, and every so often he'd go and see how she was, and so he was very, very vulnerable. It's a terrific documentary. And then there's also a smashing bit where he goes to Israel, where they were doing the first ever retrospective of his work as a composer that had been mounted anywhere, and he had great feelings for Israel, but also he's clearly so moved that he's being recognised as a composer. So it really catches him at moments where he's let his traditional mask, or his cape, one should say, slip.
And a very, very charismatic. I mean, you just drawn in on him totally. It is extraordinary. A very different kind of musical animal on the third DVD, Pierre Boulez, The Future of Music. I have to say, I found this absolutely tremendous. His that razor-sharp intellect and his ability to convey incredibly complex thoughts incredibly simply.
I think that's entirely right. It's an absolutely fascinating film, and Boulez is one of the great thinkers of our time. I think in some ways he's gone from being one of the great polemicists to one of the great thinkers. We hear all these stories, not least in Alex Ross's book, The Rest is Noise, which came out a couple of years ago. There are all these stories of prickly Boulez when he was younger, being, in some cases, downright rude to esteemed composers because they weren't composing according to his own rules and his beliefs of what music should do. On the other hand, it's rather wonderful that anyone should ever have such fierce feelings about music and its place in society in the first place. And also, with the progress of time, he has, as people do, mellowed. And this happens to so many people. With great comedians, they generally stop being funny. With polemicists who also possess a great mind like Boulez, they actually become more interesting and more, I think, more widely accessible to more people. So this documentary does make me wonder whether in fact he's influencing more people now than he ever did when he was screaming and shouting.
Absolutely, and it contains absolutely glorious and it contains an absolutely glorious performance of Debussy's Jeu, as well as a couple of his own works, Notation and Répond. And the last category we're going to consider is opera. Now, this is a very unusual sort of trio of operas. I think, certainly if you look back through the history of the awards, and I think in a way it says how far we've moved away from the sort of core repertoire where people just mind endlessly the same old operas. I mean, we've got 3 works, 2 brand new to disc, Peter Maxwell Davies's Tavenner and Kaya Saariaho's Lamour de Loin, and then Wagner's Götterdämmerung. Let's start with the Wagner, because that's not so unusual, or the circumstances surrounding the recording perhaps are slightly unusual.
Yeah, it is unusual to have just a Götterdämmerung, and it remains to be seen whether the Halle Orchestra will continue with the rest of the Ring.
Although, as I have to say, I quite like the idea of... Because, I mean, everything has to be cycles. You know, gone is the day when a conductor just wanted to record the Eroica.
Yes, that's true. However, I personally like the Ring altogether because it's a continuing story. But what this does is it allows us to view Götterdämmerung in isolation in a way that we often aren't able to, and it's often in cycles somewhat overshadowed by the other works. Of course, people talk about the Immolation at the end, and to an extent the Funeral March, but really people talk about the performance of the Wotan, who of course doesn't appear in this opera, Siegfried, who has his biggest trial in the opera named after him, and Brynhilde, who is sort of omnipresent in Valkyrie, Siegfried and Götterdämmerung, but they talk as much about the others as this. So sometimes I do feel it's not given its due as the weightiest of the operas, and that certainly comes across here. It is a bleak, monumental, mammoth piece of work, but it also works as incredibly gripping drama, and it works when that sense of gripping drama comes from the pit. And that's the great glory of this set. Mark Elder's work with the Halle Orchestra, they recorded this as a statement of where the Halle have got to under Elder's inspiring leadership, and that's what really comes across, that you have an absolute clarity, an absolute musicality, but there's also a sense of the elemental, and that comes from the fact that Elder studied with Reginald Goodall, the slowest, pretty much the slowest Wagner conductor on record, but also, as Goodall fans will know, one of the most riveting. Interestingly, Elder also studied with Sir George Solti, who was one of the faster Ring conductors on record. And I think what he gets here is he gets that sense of the elemental from Goodall, and from Solti perhaps he gets the sense of the excitement of the moment and knowing when to ramp up the amps.
It's certainly very dramatic at times, isn't it?
It is. It's very well, certainly solidly cast, given that there aren't Wagner singers generally around today of the standard of even a generation ago. But Katharina de Lehmann is terrific as Brynhilde, and it works as drama.
Now, the other 2 operas, rather unusual, both set in the Middle Ages. Maxwell Davies's Tavenner, which is one of those operas about music, about a composer, and Saariaho's Lamour de Loin, which is kind of about courtly love, I think. Quite difficult. Certainly the Saariaho, the musical language, is quite difficult. This is not an easy listen.
Yes, it is one of these categories this year which makes one think that, well, we've got enough categories, but one does think that just having the category opera almost isn't sufficient, because these pieces are so hard to compare. Saariaho I think she's such a musical poet, and she invents her own language almost as she goes along sometimes, and it can be hypnotic, and I think is here with Kent Nagano popping up again with a a stunning performance. I don't know what he's been having in his cereal lately, but it's clearly
It is
working.
fantastic. But this is absolutely the sort of repertoire he does so well. Although, you know, as the other categories have proved, you know, he turns out to be a wonderful Wagner conductor and a wonderful Beethoven conductor. But the clarity and the transparency, and particularly Sariaho's musical language, which you say is very luminous, is just perfect.
Yes, and I think the key is there's an absolute precision in what he does, which doesn't always serve him so well. But here it feels as though he knows exactly what he wants the orchestra and indeed the singers to do. To give a comparison of a singer, I can't remember, I think it was Maria Callas who said, whenever you go for a note, you must envisage the note before you hit it, and then you can do what you want with it. And I got that sense from this recording, that Nagano knew the effects he wanted before he got there. He knew he knew how to accent Sariaho's poetry, if we want to come back to that analogy, and it works brilliantly.
Now, the other opera, Maxwell Davis's Tavenner, is also conducted by somebody with an incredible feel for new music, not surprisingly, as he's a very fine composer himself, Oliver Nusson. This was a studio recording made by the BBC of Tavenner, and it's really hard to imagine it done better. Some fantastic singing. The way Maxwell Davis weaves in Tavenner's own music in this extraordinary story of really a man's kind of religious betrayal, almost.
It is incredible, and I think the way that he weaves in Tavenner's own music, I mean, that's such a difficult thing to do. When you think of, I mean, there have been some great operas about composers, of course, Palestrina, which comes to mind, but to do that without letting the music of the composer you're writing about overshadow your own musical voice is, and not just in opera. We've seen that's the common difficulty with plays like Schaffer's Amadeus, of course. That was the dilemma. How much Mozart do they put in here? And somehow Maxwell Davis manages to pull it off. He, as you say, he creates a link between our musical age and Tavenner's own musical age, so that he shows how Tavenner's story can have and this is a cliche, but can have a relevance today. It feels fresh, and certainly when it's performed as vividly as it is here, with Oliver Nusson, who is the sometimes unsung hero of contemporary music, at the helm. It isn't often done, sadly, because I think it's something of a masterpiece. But if you want a recording, this really is the one to have.
It would be lovely if it were revived. I think it would be a terrific show to watch.
Yeah, it would.
To the right honourable my singular the glory in my most humble manner I have ye recommended to lordship. It may please your honour to be advertised that the friars and their brethren, it is we lament their great poverty, knowing no way how to provide